Hello and welcome to the Nordic Mythology Podcast. Before we jump into the episode, I just wanted to quickly give a thank you to everybody. As some of you will have noticed, this is episode 50, which is unbelievable. Me and Mathias started this as a bit of a passion project once a month, and it quickly became fortnightly. And then now every week we employ a producer, an editor, and, it's been growing. So that's pretty much down to everybody that's taking the time to listen and support us on Patreon and buy the merchandise as well. So thank you very much for that. Let's jump into the show. So I'm Daniel Farron, co-owner of the company Horns of Odin, and I'm joined as always by Dr. Matthias Nordvig.
Hello, everyone. And another special announcement. Today is the Sami National Day. Just wanted to say congratulations to all the Sami people out there, the indigenous inhabitants of northern Scandinavia. So Liikkupäivin to all of you. And now I will introduce our guest, Professor Martin Carver, who I think deserves a little longer introduction. So I'll just read your bio from the University of York's professional page. Are you telling me not to?
Go on then.
Well, so I just wanted to let everybody know what a special guest we have today. So Professor Martin Carver was an army officer for 15 years, a freelance archaeologist for 13 years, and has been an academic for 20 years. His specialties are archaeological practice and proto-historic Europe. He has a degree in mathematics and chemistry from UCL and a diploma in Anglo-Saxon studies from the University of Durham. He was elected as the first secretary of the newly formed Institute of Field Archaeologists in 1982 and vice president of the Society of Antiquaries in 2002. And he was also appointed professor of archaeology at York in 1986 and was head of the department from 86 to 96. And yeah, I'll stop there. very, very much welcome, Professor Carver.
Very much. You can call me Martin. It's easier because I don't
absolutely
necessarily respond to Professor.
No, thank you very much. I think this is probably the episode I've been most excited about. After you kindly replied to my email, I was pretty excited to get you on, and very thank you for taking the time to join us. I imagine it's a very busy time at the minute with.
Sorry for keeping you all waiting.
Don't worry about it. We're used to it. Our producer only just woke up anyway, so. So I mean, I think the main thing to speak about would be obviously Sutton Hoo. Are you able to give a quick outline on what Sutton Hoo is and its importance?
Yeah, sure. Sutton Hoo is a cemetery. It's actually a series of 3 cemeteries, but you can't see much now. Basically, there's a little group of low mounds just parked on an upper terrace beside the River Deben in Suffolk. And the Deben is flowing away to the North Sea, and the place that these burial mounds are is just about the tidal limit. So just beyond there, you could once have crossed on a ford, but now there's a bridge, Wilford Bridge there. So it's quite an interesting place, and it sort of could be said to be the front door of the East Anglian Kingdom, because people come in by sea, come up the rivers, and if you came up the River Deben, you would eventually spot these mounds when they were still at their proper height. Mm-hmm. On the right-hand side. And you can imagine people giving instructions like that, just the way you find us is, etc. And then,
do you know how tall the mounds would have been originally?
Yeah, we reconstructed Mound 2. We excavated the whole mound. And when we found it, it was about 2 meters above ground level. And we realized that all these mounds have been ploughed. So they've been quite heavily ploughed in the 18th, 19th century. So they're nothing like the height they once were. So we worked out the height, because around this mound too, there was a ditch, which was a quarry ditch. Mm-hmm. And that quarry ditch had the sand and soil taken out of it to build the mound. So we could calculate the volume of earth that had been taken out. And we knew the diameter of the mound. And therefore, with an amazing equation, which was about a foot long, they could work out roughly what the height was. Basically, it's about 5 to 6 meters. That's the height. So if you stand on top of Mound 2, as we reconstructed it, if you go down there, stand on top of that mound, you get a really smashing view of the river and Bridge and Melton opposite, across the river. So you would have been able to see quite a long way up towards the North Sea and quite a long way down, other way around, down river towards the North Sea and up towards the site of Ufford, which was the old ford there. So that's what's there at the moment, except that you've also got the National Trust's visitor centre, because that's who owns the site now.
So I imagine they would have been very much visible. I must admit, I've not been down there yet. Is it quite flat around that area anyway? Yes,
it's a flat landscape, but the gravel terrace takes it up about 30 feet from the level of the river, about 10 meters higher than the river. So that's along that terrace is where the mounds are. So they're well out of reach of the water, but they would have been looking down on a much wider river than the river is there now. So the river's been embanked in the 17th century. So basically there would have been quite a wide area. That area would have been wide enough to turn around a 27-meter long ship, which was the one buried in Mound 1. And incidentally, we are building a replica of that ship at the moment.
Oh, wow.
Opposite the burial mounds in Woodbridge, there's a former shipwrights premises, Wistock it's called, and we've acquired that. And we have a group called the Ships Company who are building this ship with oak, which they've acquired, and a splitting. So that's going to be a huge adventure. If we ever get out of lockdown, we'll be able to finish it and do some traveling, just like the wonderful traveling voyages that have been undertaken by Roskilde, for example, and the Norwegian experimental craft. So we're a bit new to this, but we're in touch with Roskilde. We have friends there, so they're helping us get organized, and so we've got every hope that we will build a boat which will actually float and not capsize like the last one I was in. That was a Viking ship.
Those Vikings don't know how to make ships.
Yeah. Well,
useless.
This was actually built in Norway. It was a ship called the Edda, which was a beautiful ship, absolutely. A wonderful ship. It was called Drøningen first, and then it was called Edda later, but it's called. And when it sank, there was this magic headline in the Norwegian newspapers, something like Drøningen til bunds. I probably pronounced that wrong. I think it roughly means Drøningen went to the bottom, which it did. But the story behind that, if you're interested, is that we were trying to see whether you could tack in a Viking ship. And there was a big theory about this vessel. They'd found a long pole, sort of forked pole, in the Oseberg burial and wondered what it was for. And then in the beautifully preserved Oseberg ship, they found 2 sockets up near the prow, and decided that by sticking the one end into the socket, and the V would then push the throat of the sail out, you could make it into a kind of jib-like formation, which ought to be able to tack. And they may have been right, but it's very possible that the Vikings knew how to tack, but we plainly didn't, because we got blown over.
What I mean, I'm a non-sailor, so what is tacking?
Tacking is when you can head into the wind a bit. So
okay.
The whole point about this is that if you've got Sutton, who had probably 40 oarsmen, it had room for 40 oarsmen, but we don't know whether it sailed or not. Viking ships also have oar ports so that you can row them.
Yeah.
But they also have masts and they also have sails. Now, if you can't tack, if you can only go the same direction as the wind, then you need quite a big crew, because you've got to be able to row yourself out of trouble if you want to go. If you don't want to go where the wind is going, which is quite true, quite a lot of. You've got cargo and things like that. However, if you can make to windward in the boat, if you know how to do that, then you don't have to have so many people, and you can have a lot more cargo. So it would hugely increase the power of, especially the merchant power of a Viking ship. Doesn't matter so much if you're a war ship, because you've got lots of people on board, and all those people can row when they're not fighting. You've probably got enough to have relief crews and so on. Well, that's Vikings. Of course, Sutton Hoo is a couple of 100 years earlier, and although the ship looks very similar, clinker-built, beautiful ship, clinker-built ship, it looks similar. It's bigger than most Viking ships, and there was no trace of a step for the mast, none at all. So we don't know,
So is the construction similar to what we know from Yachtswing and Nydam?
Not really. No, they're earlier, and they tend to have Nydam has sewn rather than riveted. So basically, it belongs to another family, which begins with Kvalshund. I suppose that's the first one, and then goes on to the Roskilde group, and the one in Denmark. What's that one called? The one it's on display. They've reconstructed the ship inside a mound. What's that one?
That's Ladby.
Yeah, that one there. So all those are sailing ships. They're sailing ships, and they are riveted with iron. So the planks overlap, and then they riveted with iron. So the Sutton Hoo ship is also made of overlapping planks, but we don't know whether it sailed. So that's going to be what we're going to do with it. Is we're going to practice rowing it. So we'll have plenty of volunteers to do that. I'm
sure you will.
Rowing it in the river, and then rowing it on a lake, and then rowing it in the sea. And then we're going to see if it sails, and then we're going to take it on shore, and then try and work out how you do a portage with it.
Oh, wow.
And this is all in the future when we build it, of course, but then the last act of this trial is to take the ship up the hill to the burial ground to see how hard that was. Imagine it using rollers and grease and all the things that have already been shown. Many of them been done by experimental archaeologists in Scandinavia, but particularly in Norway and Denmark. They've done some fantastic work, and also some amazing voyages. So we are hoping to do something similar with an earlier ship.
Do we know what a boat like that would weigh? Like, say, if it's made out of oak, I imagine it would be pretty heavy.
Pretty heavy as well. If it's don't forget, it's got iron rivets.
Yeah, absolutely.
We know there's about 3,000 of those to hold the thing together. These are all hull first builds, as you probably know. You make the shell, that's the hull, and then you put in the wooden frame and the thwarts, and also the benches, the things, all that come in second. So the hull alone is amazingly heavy. but it displaces the water, and then you've got, because it's hollow, you've got displaces the water, and then you've got a tremendous carrying capacity. 27 meters, quite long. It's quite bigger than the average yacht. So. Anyway, that's an adventure to come. But
it is, yeah.
More about the site you're interested in. I think the main thing to know about it is that things moved on a lot since the days depicted in the film The Dig, which we've been, everyone's been going, there's been a big media storm about it over the last week. I have to say, I did like the film, and I thought the acting was absolutely amazing, really, really brilliant.
I really enjoyed it.
Oh, good. I'm glad you did. It doesn't tell you much about the archaeology, really. And as you've probably noticed, if you've been to the site, that it was actually filmed somewhere else. It's filmed in Surrey. But I don't think that was... I was a bit offended by this to start with, but I realised I was wrong, because filming it in Surrey, they've produced the scene of the 1939 excavations when they excavated this big boat. A big expanse of heath. If you go to Sutton Hoo, you don't see a big expanse of heath anymore. It's entirely surrounded by cash crops, turf and potatoes, things like that. So it doesn't look like it would have looked like wild heathland in the 1939. So I think that was a good move. And I think the excavation was, they did their best by reconstructing it and so on. But of course, the actual excavation wasn't quite like that. But I thought the film was fine. It for what it did, a really nice portrait of a little group of kind of middle-class English people on the brink of Second World War, trying to sort out all their social problems and so on. It was quite, for me, yeah, it was good. It was like sort of Chekhov for me. It was really, really nice, kind of rather sad, and
it's quintessentially British as well.
Yeah, and the acting was just so fantastically good. I mean, I would not have believed that Ralph Fiennes, who's what is he, Voldemort, isn't he?
Voldemort, yes.
He really came across as really pretty convincing Basil Brown. So you can imagine in the real thing that happened was that we had they had two seasons. They had a 1938 season, and they just dug trenches through 3 miles, which was quite successful. They realized all three had already been dug, which is pretty normal for any set of barrows. They found scraps of stuff which suggested much more likely to be medieval than Bronze Age. I think everyone was expecting there to be Bronze Age mounds, cluster like that. But it looked as though, oh no, this looks more like something early medieval. They weren't quite sure what. And then the next year, the landowner said she'd like to dig the biggest mound, which is the Mound 1. And that was the one which contained the big ship. And the ship contained the treasure. So that itself, I think, is a really a starting point for the next phase of the research, which is what I was involved in. And I expect you know a bit about the actual burial itself. Is that something you want me to talk about particularly?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for the people who are listening. So when you said they've been excavated before, is that professionally or by people looking to steal what they can, or both?
Well, we have two phases. In fact, one of the things we did in our project was to excavate the earlier excavations, to try and find out what sort of the excavations had taken place before. Mm-hmm. Basically, there's two major campaigns. The first one is beginning of the 17th century, 1600s, something like that. And they did vertical shafts. So the mounds must have been bigger in those days, and they went to the top and then drove a shaft right down the bottom as far as it could go, till they hit something juicy, and then they would collect the finds. And that had happened in Mound 2, and it also, I think most of them had been done, as a matter of fact, Mound 1 was also done, but Mound 1 was a sort of more of a lozenge-shaped mound, more like a ship-shaped mound, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. And the end of it had been cut off by ploughing. So when they sunk their shaft down, they sunk it down the middle of the mound as it then was. So they missed the burial chamber by some way. So they went down, they must have gone down about 10, 12 meters. And at the bottom was a 17th century gin bottle, one of these Bellarmine flasks. So they'd obviously got to the bottom and thought, oh, that was a waste of time. And then got out before they were buried. So they missed the chamber. Mound 17, they also missed the chamber. We also found a hole there. Mound 17 had 2 burials in it. Burial of a young man, and next to that, the burial of a horse. So that they came down between the two. So that's how Mound 17 was the second intact burial. Mound 1 and Mound 17, they're 2 intact burials.
So when they do that, kind of, I guess it's almost like a drilling straight down. Does it just destroy everything that it goes through?
Yeah, well, they're looking for treasure, so they know what they want. And they know that there's a burial there somewhere, and they know that burials often have things in them. Mm-hmm. I don't suppose they knew exactly what sort of burial it was, but even if they find, something of bronze or whatever, I mean, obviously they're hoping for gold. And from the point of view of the history of archaeology, this takes place round about the end of when the Reformation has happened. And therefore, there's a lot less, let's say, superstition about interfering with mounds. In other words, the agenda switches from trying to respect a burial to looting it, and the great the idea in that age was trying to get as rich as you can, so that they would have got away with quite a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. The second campaign is in 1860, and we know that because it was actually in the newspapers of 1860, the local newspapers, and the method there was to drive a trench at ground level straight through the mound, and then somewhere along that trench you'll find the burial, and then you collect the burial. However, in the 1860s, landowners had changed their view quite a lot. So although it's still, if you like, their mounds, they were more interested in the antiquarian viewpoint. This is the time when there were lots of societies going around, lots of people interested, lots of meetings. And in fact, you had kind of lunch parties, invite lots of friends, and say you are invited to a grand lunch with lots of wine, and then afterwards there will be a mound opening, and then the labourers are put to work so that they've got something nice to see. Then they go out afterwards, and then they get shown the things as they come out of the ground. When we re-excavated Mound 7 and Mound 5, both of them had steps cut in the natural, leading down into the chamber, so that people could come down, and gentlemen in their top hats would come down and look, and the ladies with their umbrellas would be standing at the top, and they would bring out what was found. So they did manage to get rid of an awful lot of stuff like that as well. And all we know about the finds of the 1860 excavation was that they said it was they thought the mounds were Roman. They said we found something like 6 bushels, which is like a measure of grain. So 6 bushels of iron screw bolts for not much use could be found. So they were taken away to the local blacksmith to be made into horseshoes. Now those, of course, were ship rivets that they discovered in Mound 2. So they didn't know what they were because they went, straight through the ship. So they wasn't much left of it.
That must be so frustrating for you as an archaeologist to see what's gone before and being done inaccurate, and the amount of knowledge that must have been lost and destroyed.
Yeah, sure, but I mean, that's what happens. And anyway, my priority's always been the story. I've been, everybody likes finding a bit of gold, and I found a bit, but I don't think it's really as exciting as piecing together what happened. And I suppose in recent years we've rather included the work of unrecorded excavations as part of the mound story. So I was actually quite excited to find these evidences of 19th century antiquities on the map. Anyway, those were the ones that we found. So that's why it was quite obvious that they'd been dug in before. You could see little, broken bits of blue glass and and gold discs which had come off a shield or something like that. So in parentheses, Mound 2, which we looked at pretty thoroughly, that was just as rich as Mound 1 once.
Okay.
And it had a ship, but the ship was over the top of it rather than the chamber being in the ship. So the ship was on the chamber and then the mound on top of that. See, that was Mound 2. So like many of our Scandinavian colleagues, we've always asked ourselves, what does this mean? What do the burial rites mean? Is it just something you choose, or are the burial rites aimed at something like a particular supernatural concept that you have? Obviously, it's clear that there is if there's a ship, the idea is that ship must be taking the dead person somewhere. Well, Mound 1 is probably the best example we've got in Britain of such a burial. It was so well preserved. It had been crushed, of course, under the weight of the mound, and also by the chamber. The chamber was really like the Gokstad chamber, if you know that. It's big, heavy timbers. And that was situated in the middle of the boat at Gokstad. So we had the same kind of setup. And that had fallen down as well. So there was this quite sort of densely packed deposit, which had in it firstly the roof, and then the lots of the finds or the artifacts that were placed in the chamber. There was a log coffin, quite a big one, which wasn't published in the 1939 report because they didn't really believe in it. But we have reason to believe in it now. A really big, massive log coffin. And then that was sitting on a floor, and that floor was sitting on the bottom of the boat. So you can see quite a lot of wood that was there, and also all these finds. And sorry.
Before we get into the actual finds of what's in there, one question I had that I've been wanting to ask all week, to be honest, is obviously we see quite a few Viking ship burials, and it's quite synonymous with Vikings. Can that be related to Sutton Hoo in any way? Could it have influenced that? Obviously, it was pre-Viking age, but I imagine some Scandinavians were living in that area at the time that migrated across. So, can that have influenced it, or were Anglo-Saxons also doing ship burials as well?
I think I think what we have to do is to sort of roll back a bit and look at the northwest part of Europe, and look at the North Sea as being a cultural zone. If that makes sense. So you've got the coast of Norway, coast of Sweden, the multiple coasts of Denmark, and the route to the Baltic. You've got the Germanic groups living in the top of Europe. And then from the 5th century onwards, there are also Germanic peoples in Britain, i.e. the English, and they are all up they're sort of on the southeast part of the island. So they're sort of stretching from Kent into East Anglia, and then into Lincolnshire, and then they start to run out a bit in Northumbria, which is sort of more like still British. And those people bring with them some of the beliefs of the northern zone of Europe, if I can call it that.
Mm-hmm.
Those beliefs are really old, because we're looking right back into the kind of observations that Tacitus made of the Iron Age people of Germania. And so it's already known that they were interested in bog burials and various other kinds of burials, and that there were also Bronze Age burial mounds, huge burial mounds. There was also ship settings, of course, in that time, and places in Sweden, for example, where stones are set in a sort of ship-like manner. Jelling also had one. And those are suggestive, very suggestive, in that the ship has a meaning, has a spiritual meaning for those people, and particularly for the person who is being celebrated. That person is, I think all one has to remember is that the ship is the most important machine in the lives of Northern Europeans for millennia. They change in the way that they're made. The technology appears to be more like frame first, skin boats, followed by hull first, clinker built boats. But it is a change, I agree. But nevertheless, the ship matters a lot. It's your main way of getting about if you're a maritime people, and this is what we think we're talking about. So those ships, I think, are wonderfully evocative of the period. You were going to ask me something else, or was that what you were?
Can I just add a couple of things to this, the aspect of like the relationships between Scandinavia and East Anglia in this context? I mean, we have, as you mentioned, Sweden. We have Uppsala as a site that has a lot of things that there seems to be a lot of overlaps, right? We have Vendel and Valskera as well as sites with overlaps. Just the recently found Høje Stene in Denmark as well. This presumably the largest stone ship setting from Scandinavia. And that one is from around 600, as far as I know. And there's also gold finds. I don't know much about it actually, because it's so new.
Bronze Age, aren't they? The one I saw at Arnundshøg, that's a Bronze Age ship setting, and so is the Jelling one, isn't it?
No, the Jelling one, I believe. So the Jelling one Jelling is actually like quite an interesting complex, because you have Bronze Age mounds. Yeah. And then you also have a very deliberate refashioning in the Viking Age, in the 960s and late 50s. You have, first of all, you have Gorm's mound, which Gorm the Old is the father of Harald Bluetooth, who Christianizes Denmark. He has a mound, and then a major ship setting made around the mound. And then you have Harald Bluetooth, who then refashions the site and puts up the Jelling stone and says, now we Christianize the Danes and all that stuff.
And Kira has a mound as well, isn't she?
Yes, and then you have a mound that's sort of like awkwardly placed on the backside of the ship setting, almost as if he wanted to anchor it or something, so that he wouldn't sail away to the death realm.
Wonderful site.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So it very much, in my opinion, it very much looks like we have a sort of an elite of society in this whole area, signaling that they belong to a similar culture, a very related culture.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think let's call it a spiritual language that endures. And I'm not so sure that it has to be an elite. I think is an elite, and maybe they're the ones that signal it most emphatically. But there is some kind of language. They speak ship, and they speak animal ornament, and all this is gathered together in the mind. But the interesting thing that happens is that not everybody buries always like this, even if they belong to the culture. So that what seems to happen is that in any community, I mean, let's say, for example, Sweden, let's think of that for a moment. They don't always do it either. I mean, sometimes you do stone settings, and then they tend to be rather prehistoric, but then later on you start building mounds. Then you have ships in the mounds, and that goes on to the Viking period. But, you know, a place like Falciada has the sequence, doesn't it? The sequence of the Vendel period and then right up to Viking period as well. Very interesting, but it's not always. See, I think there's some kind of big discourse in the area of the two seas, the North Sea and the Baltic, where they're very conscious of what's happening further south. Sometimes you're not bothered. Sometimes you take advantage of it. Sometimes you're quite worried and you need to defend yourself or defend your, let's call it, defend your spiritual province from what's coming at you. And to go to the place I know better in Britain, we don't have mounds very much in the Anglo-Saxon period. They don't start to appear until quite late in the occupation, like late 6th, early 7th at the earliest. And that's the first lot of mounds that we have. And they're quite small, and they're all quite a small group, and they're all in East Anglia. So the first question that I put when I was appointed to do the second campaign in the 80s and 90s, when we looked at the great ship burial, was why that? Why there? Why then? That's what we wanted to ask, because we knew that ship burial wasn't continuous. They were quite few and far between, and they were particularly, you know, it happened very seldom. But when it did happen, a lot of it happened together. Sutton Hoo, Snape, and so all those things happened at the same time. What was going on at that time? Well, the conversion to Christianity was going on at that time. We know that because we've got Augustine arriving. We've got a Christian Queen of Kent, Redwald, who was probably buried in Mound 1, had been to see the King and Queen of Kent and asked about this Christianity, what's coming our way. And they said, well, there are advantages, disadvantages. And I think those debates will have happened quite a lot. And so that, for me, that makes ship burial, firstly, definitively pagan, and secondly, definitively spiritual. So I don't buy this question of, oh, well, they thought they might as well put him in an old boat, you know, why not? Because they just happen to have one lying around, you know.
I doubt that. I mean, it must take some effort to carry, not only to carry the boat there, but to also then cover it in the amount of muck and dirt. To cover the whole thing must take some time.
Absolutely. And I think those things too, I don't know whether this has been studied elsewhere, but we were very interested in the amount of earth, as I mentioned, that makes Mound 2. But when we dug Mound, which one was it called? Mound 5 is the earliest there. We dug that. It was really interesting because they didn't have a quarry ditch. They had two sets of pits. On one side, that is on the eastern side, there was a little ring of pits. And then on the other side, there was a long sort of straggling trench. So it was as though two different kinds of people had been digging out soil to make the mound. In other words, there is a relationship of some sort between the number of people and the kind of people who make the mound and the person being celebrated. In other words, it's something you could, everybody can do it, even if they're not rich. They can go and dig a hole, carry a basket and put something on the mound. And in the case of Mound 5, in the pits, which we rather think of as the sort of the upper class effort, they had bones of oxen in the pit. They'd been eating. There'd been a funeral feast of some sort. I mean, very badly preserved, so it didn't look all that grand. But there's no doubt that's what they were. They were cattle, and that they'd been butchered. So we started to see something of the ceremony for Mound 5, which was the earliest mound. Not nearly so easy with Mound 1 because it was all flattened. But yeah, so, but I have no doubt at all that that's what we have trouble with is reading it and translating that into something which is comparable to a book religion, because that is so much more specific.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I really like this. I think it's really interesting to consider that it's a sort of a reaction towards what's coming from the South, right? We're seeing a missionary a push from the Frankish area, and the Pope is also involved. We want to Christianize Britain, and this is right in that period, very very close to sort of the end of the pagan era in the middle of the 600s, if I remember correctly, right? That these mounds go up. So that makes a lot of sense. I think, what's his name? The Danish German archaeologist Minos is the nickname he goes by. He's written an article about the grave and this little X type hammer. Yeah.
Hammer. Yeah. That was very interesting. Yeah. Yes. Yes, I know that guy. I met him in Sweden. I'm just trying to remember what his name is. Anyway, he's right. For some time, it was. If you haven't, for those who haven't seen it, it's like a long iron shaft. It has a little ring on one end. On the other end, it has an axe and a hammerhead. They're sort of joined together. And when it was found in the bottom of the boat, and people didn't quite know what it was, but they thought, oh well, probably it's to mend the boat, or to make the boat, or it's a boat builder's axe, and so on.
Yes.
But
okay.
It was reread by the scholar
Andres Dobat. That's his name.
Andres Dobat. Exactly. He looked at it again, realized that it was for killing cattle, and that this was like a ceremonial axe hammer to dispatch sacrificial cattle. And I thought this was a great idea anyway, but I just mention in brackets that fast forward about 15 years, and a friend of mine was digging up in Scotland, in Rhynie, and there they have pictish standing stones. And those pictish standing stones were pointing towards the site which he excavated. That site he excavated had a big hall in it. It had more places for the standing stones. It had fortifications, and it had pits which were full of calcined cattle bones. And it also had, crazily, some manufacture of souvenirs. And amongst the souvenirs was a miniature axe hammer, very like Sutton Hoo. In other words, this seems to be in the same kind of spiritual zone. The head of the community is responsible for bringing luck by sacrificing a bull or a cow. Then it's eaten, and then the bones are burnt on the bonfire, and so on. But because people are encouraged to visit this place, a bit like the comparable places would be somewhere like Heli, I suppose, in Sweden, sacred places which are being visited. They're like attracting if they were Christian, they'd be pilgrims, but it's very common in prehistory to find evidence of this. Usually they send them up a hill, but going on an island is just a little bit easier, and it's not so difficult to get to Rhynie. It wasn't that interesting. So that was like a really nice connection, which we weren't really expecting. But of course, the Picts aren't the same as the Scots. The Picts are the eastern settlers of the north part of Scotland, and they're just as near Scandinavia as the rest of eastern England. So that's why I think it's related. But yeah, I quite agree. That's amongst the many things there. But we have to get used to Sutton Mound One ship having a lot of different kinds of messages. And what I try and understand is what might have happened on the day of burial. The ship lies open.
Just before we get into the actual goods inside the ship, one thing I just wanted to quickly ask was to pull it back to the actual burial itself, how we were saying Christianity was kind of imposing or on its way.
Yeah.
Now, do you think that the ship itself being so big and such a big celebration, do you think it's almost a way of them, I guess, kind of not necessarily showing their might, but kind of celebrating pagan culture as Christianity looms in and kind of knocks on the door? And it's such a big sort of message.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're quite down-to-earth people now, so we always assume that everything has an explanation which is more or less rational, and that if we're going to invest in something like burying a ship and putting treasure in it, then it ought to have an impact on those that are trying to overpower you in some way. However, I think that's to be a bit too down to earth. It seems to me that what might be happening is similar, but more spiritual in character. So, for example, Burma many years ago did a very interesting study of the burial mounds along or up the River Rhine and their dates. And he followed it by an extremely interesting paper, another very interesting paper, which was about the earliest churches and their dates. And you could see these burial mounds starting at the mouth of the Rhine and sort of getting later and later and later as they headed towards Switzerland. And then they were followed by churches, which seemed to do the same thing. In other words, it's maybe that the powers that you believe exist and that are propitiated by burying gold and burying and building mounds, that those powers need to be on your side. And if you feel there is another power, another supernatural power heading your way, which seems to have a lot of people believing in it, then you need to call up your gods to protect their territory. And it seems to me that a lot of the ritual that we are observing, not to mention the art, is geared to that. So although it's exceedingly unfashionable and we're not meant to think about old religion or anything like that, there's no doubt that human beings have always been a bit like that, and they've certainly been very spiritual. Even Neanderthals are thought to be spiritual these days, and there's evidence for it as well. So, yeah, I think what we're dealing with is an explosion of ritual activity designed to protect you from what is seen as an alien set of beliefs.
If I can just add something here, I think that makes so much sense considering the broad spectrum that we have of, what could be interpreted as ritual deposits in the pre-Christian period in Scandinavia, which I'm familiar with. You see in a site like Gulma, for instance, gold deposits. They, from our modern way of thinking about things, they don't make much sense. It's like burying a Rolls Royce or something like that. But of course, in their world, it did, right? And they're imbuing the landscape with protection, with with the sort of they're basically gaining the interest and favor of the gods. So that makes perfect sense that they to me that they would do the same when they are seeing the approach of Christianity, and then they would simply sort of like bulk up with ritual landscape.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Goom is really interesting, and that's got a lake, isn't it, and marsh around. So it's the god's home. Is that right?
Yes, that's the literal translation of the word.
They're definitely addressing directly
Yeah.
the deity and saying, "Okay, we'll give you lots of treasure if you protect us."
Yeah,
it's interesting. I think there's been, if I'm not wrong, you've had some really interesting projects, haven't you, on early religion in Scandinavia. The guy at Stockholm, what was he called? Had a big project there. Memory, can't remember. Anyway, it's been, some of it's been published already, and I think there's more to come. You know, it's one of those really big studies.
Yeah. There's also in context of 536, this year of calamity. We're not entirely sure what happened, but it's generally known as the Dust Veil event.
It's an Atlantic volcano, isn't it?
Yes, that's the general theory, which is probably the correct. In that context, we are also seeing Morten Axbo, is the Danish archaeologist who has worked with that, with deposits that seem to be directly in relation to that event. Just like we also see a lot of imagery of the sun, seemingly. That's at least how it's interpreted on picture stones.
Price has been writing about this, hasn't he?
Yes.
I mean, what do they think the material response is then to that nuclear winter or whatever?
So deposits of gold is what we're seeing, at least in the Danish area, as far as I remember. Morten Axbo's analysis. I haven't. It's been a while since I read him, but yeah, ritual deposits of gold, very much in the same vein of like imbuing the landscape with power. Probably because we're seeing a heavy impact on crops. And I mean, in some places in farther up in Scandinavia, in the Swedish and Norwegian area, there's a loss of settlements that, in some places range around 70% of settlements disappear.
What is it? How are the settlements being lost? Are they just being deserted, or are they flooded, or?
They're deserted, probably because there's no farming becomes incredibly problematic up there.
Style, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. So the hoards are found just in the ground in the settlements, but not anywhere special, not in bogs, for example.
That I don't remember exactly. I would sort of expect that there would be bog deposits too, but I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah. There were some earlier, weren't there? There was quite a few bog deposits.
Yeah.
Right back to certainly through the Iron Age, if I remember rightly, in different places. Yeah.
Absolutely, also in the Bronze Age and also in the Viking Age. So some of these have to be also bog deposits, but I just can't remember it that well, unfortunately.
I mean, we've got a common ground here, that there is a lot of thinking people in the early or the Bronze Age Scandinavian style. So let's say the first millennium AD. There's a lot of thinking people in the North Sea Baltic region, and their thoughts are not written down, so they've rather been despised as intellectuals, but I don't see that that's true. It seems to me that what we are looking at in the archaeology is the result of some philosophies which are just not easy to articulate because they're written in material terms. But I think that doesn't make them inferior.
I very much agree.
I think it's so fascinating how it was done. Then I think it's easy for us to look at it from a modern perspective, and you said burying treasure. What what's the purpose for that? But sometimes you have to take a moment and try and look at it through their eyes from a perspective that they don't have the advantage of science that we have now for the reasons for why things happen. So when something negative happens, it might be a famine or crops don't grow or any sort of natural disaster. I guess it's an offering of what's wealthy to you. Give it to the land or what you believe in, and hopefully it fixes the issue. And it might sound silly, but you've got to. It's not that these people were stupid. It's just they didn't know any better, so they did what they believed in at the time.
I think that's bang on, and I think also you've opened another possibility, which is that when you find something like the Mound 1 ship burial, the discourse is always about, oh, what a rich person, and oh, they had in there what they wanted, voyage, or it's our representative, and that representative is going well equipped, in the general direction of Valhalla. But when you think of kind of early medieval sovereign negotiation, what actually happens is that if you have an enemy living on your boundary and you don't particularly want to fight because you think you might lose, you go to that enemy with a large amount of treasure. This is what we think the Staffordshire Hoard was. And you say, okay, look, what about this treasure, and leave us alone? It's a propitiation act. So the Sutton Hoo Mound 1 ship, for me, could easily be propitiation aimed at the spiritual power. This is not just a dead person, but a dead person who's being sent to you. We know where he's going, so we might as well pile stuff with him. So when he gets there, he'll be listened to.
Do you think
I'm making it up, of course, you realise that.
Do you think that the goods in there probably belong to multiple different people? The people would have come and brought and left something valuable in that from their own, rather than it all belonging to the actual person who was being buried?
Yes, we know quite a lot about this, funnily enough, because the material has been so well studied by the British Museum. Rupert Bruce Mitford and his colleagues did such a super job on it. And we can imagine that a lot of it is homemade, and he demonstrated that. So that, for example, the sword and the shoulder clasps and the buckle and the baldric, all those things were they seem to be, very special, gold and garnet, beautiful stuff, but probably local, probably made locally. And so they probably did exist in that sense. The helmet is also thought to have been made locally, and is particularly interesting from the point of view of the symbolism. You probably know it. It has this dragon coming over the ridge of the crown of the helmet, and then the dragon's teeth ends on the head, rather ends on the forehead here, with its snarling teeth, and it meets a bird which also strangely has teeth, and that's displayed across the face, with the wings being the eyebrows and the body being the nose and the tail being the moustache and so on. So that's an amazing composition, which is definitely full of symbolic meaning. It would have once had little tiny plaques with some well-known Scandinavian themes, like warriors dancing and so forth. So those things seem to be locally made, but belong to the kind of the wider spiritual province, which we are hypothesizing about here. Other things, though, come from elsewhere. So the hanging bowls made of copper alloy with enamel escutcheons, 3 of those, rarely smart. They're almost certainly from northwest Britain. They're from, let's say, Celtic workshops. And then in the coffin was quite a lot of clothing. And I think that this is probably the bit that gets least attention, but it's very, very interesting. And the most luxurious part of this clothing was 3 cloaks. They seem to have been dyed yellow, sort of tufted cloaks and dyed yellow. They seem to, according to the Elizabeth Crowfoot, came from Syria. And so they're actually importing quite a lot. The silver comes from Constantinople, the silver and the big silver dish and the bowls, which have all got crosses on. They're finger bowls, basically, for dining. They've got crosses marked on the base of the bowl or inside the bowl. And people say, oh, well, he's really a Christian, obviously. Otherwise, he wouldn't have a dish like that. But actually, it's quite hard to find a silver dish which doesn't have a cross on at that time. You've got to have started making it from scratch in the north. So, yeah, that's where you get them from. So the outreach is quite, I think it's quite well proven now, but only certain things. So the cauldrons are local. Lots of the clothes are local. The regalia is mainly local. The sword and baldric and so on. Also the so-called standard of sort of iron thing with bulls' heads on it. That appears to be a local thing as well. But other things come from elsewhere. So, yeah, I think the idea of gifts, we haven't mentioned the coins. They're all from, France. So we haven't mentioned the gifts, but yeah, I think people would send gifts, certainly. I think this is part of the diplomatic process. Somebody's died, we'll go to the funeral, bring something in a gift.
It's something we do today, I guess. Just still, you take flowers or you take something as a kind of a message.
Yeah, we do. We're a lot meaner today. We don't put any money in there.
No, we don't. So, the helmet is obviously kind of the top, the pièce de résistance of the find in most people's eyes. It's the thing you see if you Google Sutton Hoo.
Yes.
Would that have been made for the burial, or is it likely that was something that belonged to the person who was buried there, and it would have been worn into battle, and then it's been buried with him?
Well, I don't know about worn into battle, but I think certainly worn. And as you may know, there was an otter fur cap amongst his clothes, which is thought to have made wearing of an iron helmet bearable. I think that was. I don't think it was made for the funeral. I think it was made for as part of the regalia, and the reason for that is that it stood inside. On the coffin and inside the chamber, and it must have stood there for some time because the iron had become brittle. So it become brittle, and when the roof fell in, it broke into lots of different sherds. And when all those were put together, there were bits that some of these plaques, these silver plaques on the outside, were already missing. So it could have been in a battle, I agree, but more likely just to be sort of fair wear and tear. But definitely had been used. I think more or less everything had been used. The boat had been used. The boat had been patched.
Okay.
Been mended. So.
The replica kind of helmet we see, how accurate do you think that is to what it would have looked like? Just in the case that it's absolutely beautiful, and the amount of workmanship that must have gone into it is unbelievable.
I think that bit is believable, rather than unbelievable. I think the workmanship, you can it's properly documented. Put it that way. The exact way that the little plaques are disposed, well, we didn't have all of them, so some of that's replication. Don't forget, it was found in sherds, so the thing had to be reconstructed. And the first time they reconstructed it, it looked a bit like a kind of coal scuttle helmet of the First World War. And they took it apart again in the 50s. And then it started to look like the present one looks like a sort of biker's helmet with biker with dark glasses and nice dome-shaped helmet. So I'm not saying it wasn't influenced by the times, but the detail, I think, has been very, very cleverly researched and has been beautifully. I completely agree with you. I think the craftsmanship has been extremely well copied. Some things have been pretty baffling. I mean, I don't know whether you've managed to make this kind of what's it called, Damascene steel, which the swords are made of. When you look at them, they've got a sort of like a curly pattern.
Yeah.
Steel has been folded over and over again with its kind of carbon lining. Fantastic. But I'm told that's, I mean, I'm not saying we haven't made some, we have, but I'm told that it's not as good as what they made.
No. I think they made some amazing, like I think it's so easy for people, especially that haven't looked into it too much, kind of to think back to that time and just think of barbarians or uneducated people. And then when you look at the helmet and just the skill that goes into it, they might not be the most educated in the sense of what we think of education now, but the know-how to make something like that is pretty amazing.
It is. And I think if you get the chance to visit the site at the same time as some of these enactment groups, I think there's one called Angel Kunin, they are very good, and they make this stuff. They have like fairs, special tables, and they show replicas they've made. When we first did the museum at Sutton Hoo, what'll that be? 2002, I suppose, something like that. The artifacts in the burial chamber were all replicated, and also the textiles. This was the most expensive item of the whole of the display, and of those objects that filled the ship, the most expensive of those was the textiles.
Really?
Yeah, because they take a lot of, it takes a lot of work to make them, and what people wore, their clothes were really the best present you could get. You didn't necessarily get a sword unless it was from a relative, but to give a person a cloak or a fine tunic of some sort, that was. We know a lot about this because of the later presence or the later bequests, I should say, in Anglo-Saxon wills. You can read, fascinating sort of groups of materials that have been left by somebody, and the clothes usually feature 3 cloaks or something like that. Also, sometimes the sword that Ulrich gave me, and who got it from Alfred, who got it from, those kind of biographies. I think they are really important. When you look at the thing, you imagine all the grave goods laid out in the boat. You could see most of them. You couldn't necessarily see the ones in the coffin, which is all the private stuff. That's all his clothes. But you could see everything else laid out. And one can imagine that there would be a time where you could, where the body was lying in state, so to speak, in the coffin, maybe with the lid off, who knows. And then there's going round. And then the parents are pointing out to the children the finds that they're looking at. The children say, "What's that then?" And they say, "Well, that is his sword. And that sword is over 300 years old because we know where it came from." Actually, it wasn't. It was quite a modern sword in those days, 7th century. But other things were older, big cauldrons. They had a story. Think of the lyre. Had a story. Had a bard who used it. It would have been known about. Silver bowls used in feasts. So all these things triggered the memory, and I think you explained to the children, and then the children explained to their children what they'd seen, because nothing was written down, but everything was still in the mind, still in the memory, and even sharper in the memory because there aren't any documents. So your memory is pretty important.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's interesting you said about the textiles almost being overlooked for the value, and maybe, I mean, I think to the ordinary layperson, probably like me, I know when I go to the British Museum or the ship museum in Norway, you kind of bypass the textiles because they're not quite as shiny or amazing as aesthetically as a helmet or a sword, or some of the woodwork, the wood carving in the ship museum. They instantly grab you, and the textiles, I guess, kind of left because they don't have the same impact. But like you say, the amount of work that goes into them, they do have so much value.
I think some of the museums, I don't know if Mathias remembers which they are, but they actually do show them off rather well, because they put them on mannequins, really elegant women and chaps, with all the stuff wearing all that makes a difference. And when they're hung up as though they were for sale,
Yeah,
they don't look really very impressive. But somebody wearing them and looking as though they're modelling them, so to speak, in perhaps in a slightly less spontaneous.
Yeah, the one that comes to mind is the Bronze Age exhibit at the Danish National Museum, where they have mannequins wearing the textiles. I was reminded of another thing, actually. Textiles do tend to play a big role in both in the saga literature from medieval Iceland and later in Scandinavian folk tales. There's often the hero who comes home from abroad. The main thing that really displays how rich he became when he went raiding in England or went to Byzantium or Russia or whatever is the dress he's wearing. That's something that they will always note in the saga literature. In the same way, you have always a hero who descends from a long line of kings is wearing a blue cloak in a folktale. That's a very standard thing, right? So I think that sort of attests a little to that being a very stable marker of importance and of course also riches, right?
Yeah. Also, think of the brooches for the women in the graves. Well, 6th century graves, particularly. We have big square heads. You have very good, lovely brooches in Scandinavia too. And those seem to be storytellers as well, because they've got little, like a quotation on them. The picture is a quotation. The picture is showing something from the the gods, from Thea and Thor and Freya, I should say, and Thor and Odin and so on, doing certain things which are in the stories, which people like Hauck have spent their whole life trying to decode them to see work out which story they're referring to. But you can see why people remember them. People remember brooches, and they remember the person who was wearing it there, and therefore it makes sense that you send the brooch off. I should think quite a lot of others were kept carefully, though, so that they could be handed down. Something that always bothers me about dating graves from grave goods is that you can't really say whether those grave goods really date the grave. It does seem to me there's quite a lot of chance of them being heirlooms. But I don't know. Maybe it's difficult to tell that because you can't get a date on the object itself being metal.
Absolutely. Martin, how are you for time? Are you
okay? Just wearing out. Okay.
Are you okay for a little bit?
I'm okay for a little bit. Yes, I think I need to draw a line about 4, if not before.
Okay, no, that's fine. Just so I can get any questions in I want to ask.
Well, to ask anything that...
Yeah, no, definitely going to get to. So the one thing I want to ask was about the helmet that I mentioned in the email to you as well, and how true it is or how accurate it is. And Mathias, you might be able to explain it a little bit better, because we've spoken about it a couple of times before about the idea of one eye lighting up
Oh yes, I don't know about that. That's something else that Neil Price came up with. It's something to do with Odin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're talking about the helmet as reconstructed or the helmet as replicated?
Matthias is probably best to.
Yeah, again, this is quite some time ago since I heard Neil talking about it, but as far as I remember, he referred to a reenactment group that had tried using the helmets at by a fire in a sort of darkly lit hall. And and it looked like one eye was sparkling, and the other one was not as lit, and
sparkling. Was it the eyebrows?
Yes, yeah, because of the inlaid gold and ruby. I can't remember.
Gold and garnet.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yeah. So and I feel like he has suggested that there's something similar going on with the Vendel helmets, but I'm not entirely sure if I'm misremembering that.
I remember the article. I think it's an interesting idea, and from the practical point of view, it wouldn't be that hard to do because you just wouldn't put gold behind the garnet, so it wouldn't refract the light. So one eye would be not winking and the other would be winking. So, it's quite a nice idea. I think if you're asking me, do I think they had all the bits? I don't know. I mean, it'd be very easy to check that out using the great big volumes of the Sutton Hoo Shipbuilding old publication.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't remember anything that was obviously missing from the reconstruction. So maybe there is something to be explained there.
Okay. I was just wondering if it was something you'd heard of or knew like conclusively whether it was real or not.
No, I think you have to ask the Sue Brunning who keeps the collection.
Okay.
It's nothing quite like looking at the original. We don't really get to look at the original that much. It's all on display now. When I was first appointed to direct the most recent campaign, I went down to the British Museum and they showed me everything. They gave me the Great Gull buckle to hold, and Leslie Webster cunningly clicked the catch at the bottom. So when I picked it up, it then sprang apart. I thought, oh, blimey, this is the way to start, like wrecking. Anyway, buckle about that. But certainly they are amazing close up. Their photography is brilliant and so on, but there's nothing quite like the real thing. And the same with the shoulder clasp. I'd love to put the shoulder clasps on or put them on somebody, and then see what it looks like under the sun, and whether they flicker and you expect them to. So.
I think you can learn so much from looking at them kind of on a table, and then when they're in use. Again, with you rebuilding the ship, I think you're probably going to learn a lot from having it in a practical, usable aspect rather than just looking at it and trying to imagine what it would be like.
So you think it's quite a reasonable type of research, doing experimental archaeology, or do you think it's just more of a vanity project? Be honest, I'd be interested to know. I mean,
I think you learn. My personal, very humble opinion would be that you learn a lot from being hands-on. I create things with my hands every day. That's kind of what I do. So I think you get a whole different perspective on things from holding it, touching it, recreating it, moving it. Even just the act of making it, there would be things that you would notice that you wouldn't necessarily get from just looking at the finished article itself. Almost deconstructing it and working back and seeing the process of how it's made. I think you will learn so much from it and how they moved it, and what they did with it, and how they used it.
I'd say that experimental archaeology is not an exact science, but hardly any any of the disciplines involved in prehistoric northwestern Europe are, so to speak. Coming from the literary side of things, that's my main background. Even though I've taken some archaeology classes. I would say that it is incredibly valuable to have people experimenting with the material side of things. Even just that little thing that if you're just stuck in your books. So many of my colleagues are. There are so many thoughts and ideas that you can get from reading the literature that wouldn't really work in reality. I see a little too far removed from reality sometimes in the literary scholarship. So no, I think it's incredibly valuable, even if mistakes are made, and even if sometimes you can't really say that you can equate there's a guy who did a study on shields and how well they hold up to being hit by swords and such things from the Viking Age. He did that in Copenhagen, I think. And there's a lot of methodical issues you could sort of criticize. One is, of course, that, well, he never really tried them in actual war. But on the other hand, I mean, it's an incredibly valuable study to really understand the materiality of using a shield and being a warrior in that situation. So
I think a great example would be Luciano of Children of Ash that we've had on here quite a few times, who specializes in sort of Nordic artwork, and he goes back and recreates a lot of the traditional pieces, and he had some amazing perspective on a lot of what it meant from redrawing it and from going over it and looking at the different patterns. So I think going through the motions of trying to recreate something really does give you a different look at it.
I think there's less skepticism than there used to be. I think when you're building a boat and you're putting it through its paces and so on, there was quite a lot of skepticism, I think, in the early days, particularly when it came to building the Mound 1 ship, particularly amongst the experts. So we haven't been able to get a research grant, for example, to do this. We're raising all the money from gifts and sponsorship and so on, because when you think about it, there's a reason for this skepticism. When we were on the Edda and seeing whether it could tack or not, and then capsized and it went to the bottom, they said, okay, so what's the point of building a replica ship of Sutton Hoo? So, in the old days, I would have said, well, we want to test various social theories. We want to know whether they had slaves and all the rest of it. But then, having been questioned about the Edda, they asked, why did you do that? So we wanted to know whether we could tag. And could you? And I said, well, no, we couldn't actually, but that doesn't mean they couldn't. So they said, what was the point of that then, since you nearly... I said, well, actually what it's for is to see what it felt like. And that touches a button these days. I mean, it wouldn't have cut any ice 10, 20 years ago. It wouldn't be considered decent, from a research point of view. Who cares what people felt like? I think people now realize, actually, yes, it's really important. It's very important. And also what skills there are. Everything survives except the skills. If you think we're going to dig up hang gliders in 20 years, or no, that's not 200 years' time, and people say, well, what are these things for, I wonder? And,
yeah.
And then you don't know because you don't have the skill with it.
So,
Sorry.
I think this is incredibly important, and this is a very, very sort of central and deep conversation that these different academic disciplines need to have with one another and themselves. Personally, this is something that has come intuitively for me. One of the ways that I have always approached the material has been through personal experiences of various kinds. I mean, portions of my PhD dissertation were on the story of Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent, and how some of the skaldic poems, the stanzas might actually relate to real experience of being at sea, and that comes straight from my own experiences of sailing as a child in Greenland, and fishing and hauling in yarn and those kinds of things. So that's something that I realized after I'd written everything, and I was like, I should have thought closer on this. But that's where some of that really came from. That's how I got that perspective. No, I think it's so really important to work with that. It is loosening up. I know that there are people out there who are working on, for instance, reconstructing the auditive scape, or however you want to say it, of the past. Like what did it sound like? And this could seem like, you could be like, well, why does that matter? Well, in our modern age, especially now, especially living in these urban landscapes and with all of these technological thingamajigs, right? There's a lot of noise around us that we have become used to, that somebody 1,000 years ago would be perhaps even terrified of. So actually working with that, I think is incredibly important too, right?
I think when you start, you do your next bit of writing, definitely to try and weave in or fold in your own personal experiences with sailing, with what the evidence is for the boat. I think that's the direction we should definitely go in. The two camps at the moment, they're too widely spaced, and the occupants have got their backs to each other. So the academic camp will only work off what is evidence. It's not fact, but it's evidence. That's how it's called, and it has to be reasoned. And the reasoning has got duller and duller. Everybody has to admit that. And sometimes you spend a long time, knowing more and more about less and less, until you know all there is to know about nothing, as they say. Whereas the novelist camp, if you like, the fiction camp, they despise it. Everyone despises everybody else. They're despising the academics. The academics are despising them. But that's ridiculous. I mean, it's shared experience. It's shared experience. If we're trying to give a new life to people who lived long before we did and had different challenges, but nevertheless were human. If we're trying to do that, then you need everything. People can still, if you're making it up, they can soon tell. But if it's based on something, if it's based on some experience that you've had, okay, we built a ship. This is what we did wrong. This is what didn't work. This is, if you're honest about it, then I think there's a really nice story to tell there. And that story then fuels another story, which everybody can enjoy. So you want to teach children about the early Middle Ages, you don't have a chance the way it's done in universities, but it would be okay, if we could somehow, I don't say fictionalize it, but novelize it, try and make it interesting, try and make it fun, try and make it into stories that don't necessarily involve endless kings and with strange names that you can't pronounce. But instead of that, ordinary people, the sort of people who make campfires and who polish things and who try and make their swords work properly and who get angry and try and take revenge. And, all those things I think are great. And they haven't found their author yet. But I'm hoping the next generation, they will find their author. And we'll start, therefore, learning a lot more as a result.
I think that almost pulls us full circle back to the importance of things like the movie The Dig, because it brings eyes onto something that a lot of people may not have already known about or looked at. Like my wife, we watched The Dig yesterday, and she was like, I knew nothing of this. I'd never heard of it. And she was so interested in it by the end. And then that leads people to go and do their own research and at least gets them involved in it. So you need those entertaining things that pull people in. And then you can get into the details and the nitty gritty and the pure accuracies.
Yeah.
I didn't think The Dig had much archaeology in it. I thought it was quite good, and it certainly attracted a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
BBC, I mean, I was slightly involved with it, but I mean, the BBC asked me to do a podcast. I did a podcast, which they called The Real Story or something. So I did a chat, a bit like this. And that was downloaded 53,000 times in the first 3 days. So
wow.
Plenty of interest. There's no shortage of interest. And that didn't have very much about the dig itself in it at all. It was about the 1939 and what happened after that and what we know now that we didn't know. So it was much more about understanding as well as trying to get something across what it feels like to dig.
Have you got time to answer a couple of quick questions before you go? Okay, so Brewer has asked, she said she would love to hear your thought about the reuse of the Sutton Hoo site. And I don't know whether she means like in modern times as a museum.
Turn your mic on, Brewer.
Or maybe, yeah, that would. Oh, there we go.
Oh no.
Hi, I'm curious about the historical reuse of the site, especially in relations to maybe the Gallows burials or some of the other earlier reuses of the area and the changes in perception of the local population as regarding the site.
Did we? No, you're right. Yes, I did mention that there were 3 cemeteries, one on top of the other. But I didn't say what they were. So the first one is a 6th century family cemetery. And then there's the Royal Cemetery, the one with the burial mounds. And that dates to the early to mid 7th century. And then after that, it becomes an execution site. So the execution site was really interesting and quite hard to excavate and quite gruesome in its way. So there were 2 sites. There was 2 sites for the gallows, and the gallows were inferred from post holes. And the people, the unfortunate people who'd been executed were just put into graves at very strange angles. They're just sort of dumped in these graves. So one lot around Mound 5 and another lot out on the track, which runs. It's a very old track which runs alongside the side of the burial mounds, and that dates from the 8th century through to the 10th. Now I don't know. The interpretation I gave that in the end was that it was a response to Christian conversion, so that when the Christian kings came, they abandoned the royal burial ground and they themselves were buried in churches. And those people who wouldn't conform, it seems to me, are the people we are seeing in the 39 burials that were excavated in the burial ground of kings. In the 12th century, the gallows, we happen to know, the gallows moved to Wilford. They stood on a hill above the Wilford. And that was so that they could take advantage of the new routeway, if you see what I mean. And then the mounds stood by themselves in the open countryside, and we didn't really have any documentation for them, but we have some archaeological evidence that many of these mounds were made into rabbit warrens for farming rabbits. Lots of holes ran through the mounds, and then there were sort of 4 big holes at the axial points so that they could put the ferrets in one end and collect the rabbits as they ran out the other. So quite a lot of the mounds seems to serve that purpose. But then, am I going in the right direction, Catherine?
I think you are. I'm sure you are.
So by the time you get to the end of the Middle Ages, then we know that the first excavations happened in that area in the time of Henry VIII by a guy called John Dee. And that was locally known as mining, so that they went into the mounds in order to get the treasure. So that sort of coincides with the shafts that we found. We also know that one of the burial mounds was excavated with a priest in attendance, in case any devils, ghosts came out.
Makes sense.
So that was so then the mounds were dug in the center. Then they were trenched later on, as I described, but between that they got ploughed. Probably the time of the Napoleonic Wars, lots of land got ploughed up so that they could plant cereals and so forth. That's when the mounds were sort of erased and rubbed flat. And then we get into the modern period. The excavation in 1860 was done by a certain Mr. Barrett, who was living there. So you know more from that moment on. But as you probably realise, that it's a fascinating piece of England, and it was quite busy in prehistory. It had its moment of glory when it was an Anglo-Saxon cemetery, and thereafter it kind of reverted to being heathland.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you very much. Let's wrap this up. I'm cautious of keeping you too long. I know you wanted to be off for 4 o'clock. No, thank you very much for spending the time. I'm sure everybody will find this extremely interesting. I know I have, and I'm sure Matthias has as well.
Absolutely.
I can just answer this last question.
Of course you can.
How likely is it that there might be similar findings in the future, or do experts believe they've found burials that size already? Yes, very interesting question. I think that the mounds have this unfortunate habit of being built with earth, and that means two things. First of all, people came and helped themselves to the earth. We know that somebody building a golf course came and quarried a lot of earth from Sutton Hoo, for example. And secondly, there's a lot of ploughing, so you can make a barrow go pretty flat. However, that doesn't mean you've lost the contents of it, because with a bit of luck, the burial will be below ground. Mm-hmm. If it isn't below ground, then the finds get disturbed by the plough and they stay in around that area. So we've got two big weapons. One is aerial photography, which can pick up barrows, particularly their quarry ditches. The other is, in Britain, we have the Portable Antiquities Scheme, which every self-respecting archaeologist in Scandinavia disapproves of. And certainly they do in continental Europe, where we allow people to use metal detectors, and they have to, or they are supposed to, declare what they find. This is how the Staffordshire hoard was found. So that means if you find these telltale bits of metal work, they are pretty distinctive. I mean, they're pretty fine, pretty distinctive, filigree, using gold and garnet and so on. So if you find something like that, then there probably is a mound in that area. So everybody's much more alert now. So what Sutton Hoo has done, and the publicity surrounding it, is that it's made everybody conscious that within the landscape, there are these monuments of immense value which have been undervalued and just sort of ploughed up to now. But I think now everybody is much more conscious that they can really affect the story of the whole country. They add to history in a positive way. So they've got a very high value, and they should be looked after.
Am I correct in remembering that there's just a couple of recent discoveries of Viking Age ship burials, maybe in northern England?
Yes, Scotland, mainly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, they're quite small boats, but the Vikings had ship burials, Orkney, Shetland, Orkney, round to the west coast as well, and Isle of Man. So a big arc around the north of the island. There are many Norse ship burials.
Yeah.
Perfect. I mean, Martin, if you ever have time in the future, I think me and Matthias would love to have you back on to speak about is it Port Mahomet? I'm gonna ruin the pronunciation.
It's just easy. Tom.
But we would love to have you on to do an episode about there and what you found and how it relates to kind of the Viking activity. If you have time, maybe next month sometime.
Yes, I might have. I'm at the moment rather weighed down because I'm trying to get these Sicilian monographs finished. But I think that the Sutton Hoo Story is a book that exists. I mean, if anyone wants to chase that up, if you just put Sutton Hoo Story into Amazon, I think you'll find it easy enough. And there's also one for Port Mahomet called Port Mahomet Monastery of the Picts, published by University Press in Edinburgh, and 2016 that was. So I think it's quite recent. And also the main report is on open access, so you can get to that as well. So there are ways of satisfying your curiosity already, and maybe when we get sort of further into the year and things ease up a bit, I'd be delighted to come back. And I'm sorry I couldn't speak to everybody, but thank you very much for the invitation. And
it's coming.
Very nice.
I could have spoke to you for. We could have done 3 hours to this show. It could have gone on for a long time. So yeah, I will email you down the line and see if we can line something up.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
It's nice to meet you.
You too.
That was your research.
Thank you.
Okay, cheers. Bye now then.
Bye.
Oh, Martin, just before you go,
Yes.
I wanted to ask: Have you raised all the money for the creating of the ship?
No, not at all. But we've got a certain amount. It's the internet address is saxonship.org.
Okay.
And they've got a big website there. It's very cheerful and merry. It shows lots of activity happening by the river. They're extremely active. They've got a brilliant secretary who's also an oarswoman, and she's really running it. She's the manager. And the people who belong to it are mainly mariners. They're yachtsmen and people who have fishing boats, things like that. So they are first and foremost seafarers.
Okay.
And occasionally they ask me, would the Anglo-Saxons have done that?
No, I asked because
usually.
I asked because I'd like to see if we could raise some money through my company to donate to. I think it would be a beautiful thing to do and a great cause.
Oh, that'd be lovely. So yeah, you want to write to Jack, JACQ.
Okay.
But if you go to the website, all the contacts are there. saxonship.org.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Great.
And thank you for spending the time.
Yeah,
Nice
All right.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Take care.
Okay, cheers. Bye-bye.